Hi, I'm Brian Schrader, and you're listening to Outstanding in Your Field, powered by Pioneer Agronomy. I'm here with my co-hosts, agronomist Carl Joern and Crystal Williams.
Think of us as IT for your crops. If we know how to fix your issues, we'll tell you. And if not, we've probably got a workaround.
And if we don't, we'll find one because Mother Nature isn't like an on-off switch.
All right. Well, on today's episode, we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive on agronomy and planting season. So last episode, if you tuned in, we went through all the ins and outs of planter calibration and more of the equipment side of things, and had a couple of great guests on that were really key experts in that space. So encourage you to go back and listen to that if you haven't already done so. But Carl, Brian, and I just wanted to take a little bit of time and work through, from an agronomist perspective, what are a few key planting items that we want to make sure everybody, as we pull the planters out of the shed and before we get out and do a few passes, some things to keep in mind. So, Carl, what do you got for us to kick off? Yeah.
I think you start us off in a great place. You said let's dive deep into this, and maybe that's a great entrance to the conversation. Planting depth. There's been some great work that's been done over the years. Whether if you've been to a goof plot site that you accidentally created yourself, where you forgot to go ahead and change the planting depth from beans to corn. Planting depth is immensely critical as it relates to, emergence, uniformity, the rapidness in which we emerge. But ultimately, you're chasing soil moisture. That's what's going to really lead to, that consistent picket fence style that we're all after. I'd say, though, that when it comes to corn planting depth, I'm pretty well committed at right around that 2 inches or so. You can get yourself in trouble by going accidentally or purposely too shallow in a lot faster manner than if you accidentally slip too deep. So maybe let's kick things off as it relates to planting depth on corn, and we can come on back to beans in a minute.
Yeah, here's what I'd say, Carl. In my history as a pioneer agronomist, I've had way more problems with shallow corn longer term than I have deeper. The great Bob Nielsen would tell you that a modern corn plant can't plant corn too deep to get it out of the ground. Now, whenever Bob would say that in a meeting, I rolled my eyes a little bit because of being in eastern Indiana with a lot of clay soils. Crusting's an issue, but subtracting crusting, you're absolutely right. I'm a little old school, so I'm a first knuckle guy still, but that on my finger pretty much is close to that 2 inches as well. Yep. A little bit of kind of a current event take on this is, as you look at the drought monitor, last week they extended the extreme drought in Indiana all the way across the state. It tickles kind of over into Crystal's part of the world now too. There's a big knob in Illinois that's in this extreme drought. And I know, looking at the window, it looks like when we get in, there's not going to be a lot of subsoil moisture. And so there's going to be this tendency for folks, I'm afraid, to want to shallow their corn planter up because, boy, if I get a 1/4 inch of rain, I'm going to start that process and things are going to go and get out of the ground fast. I think your comment about chasing moisture is key, but not chasing rainfall moisture. Let's chase soil moisture. And so I'm with you. 2 inches is a really good depth for modern corn hybrids. I just really have been adamant this winter as I've talked to growers to make sure that we don't shallow that up. I know that's what you want to do, especially if the soil is dry when you plant. But that there's just way too many things. And we can talk about floppy corn syndrome. We can talk about the potential risks of pre-emergent herbicides in those kind of situations and everything. But I'm with you personally. I think 2 inches, 1.75 inches, someplace in that neighborhood is a great place to go.
Perfect. Crystal, you're in northern Illinois. You've got a little bit different ground than what Brian and I get to play with. But let's say that you got a big rain front coming through, and we're in the middle of our optimal window. How do you coach folks through when it's time to park the planter? What's the thought process there?
Well, I think the key that I always keep in mind is just as you look out on the weather beyond the rainfall event, maybe, and the calendar date, right? We always get obsessed on what's the calendar? Is it going to turn to May or what are we looking at? But really looking at that trend of weather temperatures as we look ahead. So, last year in 2025 was a great example of everybody was slamming everything in the ground as hard as they could last few days of April. And then just because that calendar date was truly turning into May and we were really in a hurry. And I think we did run into some challenges, obviously, with some heavy pounding rain. We can't really control that, but it did have a cooling trend as you looked in the forecast. So
Yeah.
trying to keep a close eye on that. And then I just did want to circle back on some of your comments with the moisture. Some of the listeners might think, even if there is a little bit of rain, if we shallow up that planting depth a little bit, really, I think we're just trying to drive the point of consistent moisture as we go into the little bit deeper planting. Yes, a little rain or dew can soak in a top couple inches or top an inch, excuse me, maybe of moisture. But really, for that consistent depth, of moisture, we need to make sure we plant at that 2 inches or even 2 and a quarter is a nice place to be, even two. Now, I wanted to actually pause on the depth and dummy it down a little bit. I guess for my own self, that's fine. But so as we're going out, let me just preface by saying, even as an agronomist, I find myself, if I'm behind the planter and trying to dig, and I always have a farmer hovering over or watching me, it's inevitable that I can never find the seed. And when I'm trying to dig through the trench, so if that happens to you too, I'm also victimized by that experience. So doesn't mean you're unprofessional. I'm also struggle with that too. So I wanted to call out that. But as we go through and check planting depth behind the planter, I often get, questions of, do you measure from the bottom of the seed, from the top of the seed? Do you just measure like on an angle from what you've dug? Like, do you go straight up? How are we measuring, or do we put something across the trench? What's your pointers for that?
So this is a great question because you might get a couple different answers here, Crystal, and that's probably what the folks are interested in hearing. No, I'm one of those where I will across the soil surface, I'll get things clear of residue, and make sure that what I'm actually, measuring is representative. So I'll kind of compress whatever that, if we've got loose debris or what have you, I'll go ahead and I'll take, usually it's my trowel or something like that, and I'll lay that across. And then from the bottom of that, or even better, your plot stakes, because we always have a bunch of those laying around in the bed. So if you take that plot stake and you have that, compressed down to kind of represent the soil surface, then I will take my depth tool, my measuring tape, what have you, and I'll measure to the top of the seed. That's how I go about doing it. But this is fun because I'm interested in hearing how Brian does it, and I'm sure listeners at home probably conduct this in myriad of ways too.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it depends a little bit on, from my part of the world, am I doing a field that's no-till, which you guys probably, percentage wise, I've probably got a little bit more no-till corn than both of you, or whether I've got conventional tilled ground, and then how tilthy the ground is. So in a lot of cases, what I find is in my conventional ground over here, we're going to get some natural compression from those rains you talked about, Crystal. So what I typically do is measure to what I'll call the firmest part of the seed trench is where I'm measuring to. I'm not as prepared as Carl, so I'm not grabbing a stake or anything like that. What I've got a tape measure in my truck door. I've had it there for years. I picked it up in the middle of the road one time when I was an agronomist in Ohio. This tape measure is probably 20 years old at this point, but it works. And it's bright orange. That would be another thing. If you're taking a measuring tool out, make sure it's bright so that if you get distracted, you know exactly where it's at. That's a personal experience. There are a couple really nice pocket knives floating around Eastern Indiana that I walked off with and left. But I don't put a stake or anything across the trench. And I actually probably measure more often to what I'd call the center point of the seed rather than the bottom of the trench. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. One, if you've got guys that are not doing seed firmers, one of the things that you're going to want to look for is to make sure there's not a gap at the bottom of the seed. We want good soil to seed contact. So I tend to measure from the center of the seed for the most part. Now that's fractions of an inch, and this is horseshoes and hand grenades, not precision laser stuff when we're measuring depth. But I go to the center of the seed, and then I go to essentially what I'd call the firmest level in the soil for me to measure. And so sometimes that does mean kind of the same thing you're talking about, Carl. You got to get the residue out of the way. But sometimes will even find that some of that fluffy stuff that guys' machines have or planters have built up, I kind of get that out of the way too, because I know that's going to compact. And so that's how I do it. The other thing that I've done, I carry a pocket knife every day. I have actually over the years sometimes even marked my pocket knife. We've got great Pioneer diggers that are measured and everything, but sometimes just for a quick check with a guy, if that's not necessarily the sole reason you're in the field looking, I just kind of mark a pocket knife every once in a while, piece of tape, or maybe even a line with a Sharpie. And that way I know where my 2-inch depth is on the blade. And that's just a quick check for me that we're close.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Nope. Those are really great pointers. I probably personally just do a combination of some of those things. I'm a little bit more like Brian, where I'm not always very prepared when I go out into the field. So hopefully, because we have a lot of corn on corn acres, I grab a corn stalk stubble or something like that to cross across the trench. But that's a really good call out, as I often see, even if we can try to press down some of that soil tilt that we've built up around that furrow. Trying to, sometimes that can kind of inflate our planting depth. But if you are getting frustrated and, not sure, you're trying to dig and find a seed and you're struggling, just be patient and, slow down a little bit, because it's not too hard for us to flick a seed out right out of the trench as we're digging in a hurry. So that's my little TED Talk seed depth.
I want to back up real quick, though, because I did mention the drought, but that's not always the planting conditions that we're in. And so I'm curious, with the different soil types that the three of us have, how do you decide whether it is, let's just say, fit to plant, whether there's too much moisture there or not enough? There are situations in part of the Corn Belt where it gets dry enough that guys are like, man, I don't know whether we ought to do this or not. So how do you guys, given your soil types, determine whether it's fit to plant moisture wise? I guess you mentioned the temperature, Crystal, but I guess in terms of moisture,
that's the thing, Brian. A lot of guys are still beholden to the calendar date to some degree, because it does inform seasonal norms for soil temp. And so for me, I've got some sands that doesn't matter how wet they are, they're not going to wad up to in a ball for a ribbon test or coiling something out. So that is part of the equation for us, is just how warm is the ground. And so that's where we do sit on the sidelines sometimes as it relates to calendar date. But beyond that, where it's not just pure beach sand, I still hold true to the idea of go ahead, to your planting depth, not to the top of the ground, right? You got to get in where you're going to be placing the seed, dig that up, and then go ahead and, just get a sense of how much moisture is in there. And for folks, if you haven't done this in the past, go ahead, get yourself, I don't know, like maybe a couple tablespoons worth of soil, thinking about if you're making cookies at home or something like that, that amount of earth. And, you just go ahead, wad that up into a ball, ribbon it out. If it ribbons out real nice, and that means that it's probably a little bit tacky, too wet for us to go ahead and get out. But, you heard me make the comment, you don't want to do the soil surface. That's not where we're planting. And then if you're just going to do that kind of 2 inches or so where you're planting, just be mindful of if it's squishier down below, we're going to be setting up a little bit of a pan layer perhaps. In that situation too. So just going out digging and getting a sense for how much moisture is out there. Other folks, they might take, you might take the soil, make it into a ball, drop it from shoulder height. And if it drops out, and it splatters, all as well. But if it holds together, then you probably need to sit on the sideline a little bit more. That's the way that I go about it, Brian.
We talk about like the square bottom shovels, as a great tool for investigating, after plants come up. But I do find like a good square bottom or a spade shovel is a great tool for this time of year to try to check that planting depth. from a soil moisture standpoint. Brian, your question made me really think a little bit because it's been a little while since we've actually had to wait for, truly dry soils, taverna soils to dry out a little bit more, I guess, in my opinion. The last couple springs in Northern Illinois have been pretty dry and very good soil moisture conditions, as I think broadly. So yeah, but to exactly Carl's point of, checking that ribbon, don't check the powder at the top of the soil, and, keep in mind your different soil types. But I do feel like, if you plant it obviously into wetter soils, you're going to have quite a few headaches later on with root restrictions and mohawk roots and all of those fun things. But I feel like a lot of it has been driven a little bit more off of temperature direction and the trend in the past couple of years here from
So
decisions.
what's your temperature? You both have mentioned temperature, and certainly it's important for us over here. I know any good agronomist is going to say as warm as possible.
Sure.
And in a perfect world, we'd love to have the soil temperature at 60, but it'd be the middle of May probably before we get to there a lot of years. What's the temperature that you all are shooting for?
Quote unquote 50 and warming, right, is kind of that's the rule of thumb. But Brian, we've had enough growers that are getting going earlier that are pushing the envelope closer to that, what you'd call, upper 40s, so if we're sitting, say, 48 degrees, that's I have no qualms about that. If you're drafting south of 45, though, you are going to start to get some pretty strong separation as it relates to cold germination, by seed lots and all that stuff. And maybe there are some genetic differences across the marketplace. And we feel very strong about our position there just with how we produce our hybrids to give us an advantage. But that 50-ish and warming is what you're aiming for. And Crystal had, she talked about an example last year about, cold rainfall event that came in. And that's what we're worried about is that first 24, 48, maybe 72 hours, but really the first day or two is what we're concerned about. Corn and beans both. So if we're sitting there too cold to start, that means that we're going to have too cold of water coming into the plant. And then that's where you can get the corkscrewing, the additional chilling, and get yourself in a bad way. So I'm that, 50-ish, but that doesn't mean that 50 is what, that's your starting point. And yeah. Maybe this is a fun question just in the spirit of how Crystal asked about how do you actually measure depth? How do we measure temperature? Is that 4-inch soil temp? Is that 2-inch soil temp where you're actually going to be planting? Is that 50 degrees for the day? Is that 50 degrees as you go out and you start in the morning? This 50 degree idea, there's a whole bunch of different ways to arrive to 50. Do you all have a manner in which you subscribe to that? As we're sitting right now, for context for our growers, March 20th, 9:30 in the morning, you're looking at mid 40s as it relates to 4-inch soil depth across, the Mesa network. So Davis is sitting in there for Purdue, the Penny Farm up by Valparaiso, the Acre Farm here by West Lafayette, the northern latitudes of the state, we're mid 40s. So what does that mean? Does that mean that it's too cold to get planting? It probably is, coming back to this idea of, closer to 50. But anyway, submitting that to you all for how do you do 50 degrees? What does that mean to somebody? How do you measure it?
Yeah. So I guess my perspective is when we think about your coolest temperature, in my opinion, as you measure the temperature, you're at least striving for that 2-inch. If not, you can check out the 4-inch and see how much of a deviation there is. But checking on that temperature, and I would recommend, that 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. That will be your coolest point of the day because you don't have the sun heating up the soil throughout the day. But also fully recognize, depending on your soil composition, and we all have some sands in our area, that temperature swing is going to be a lot more drastic comparatively, depending on, how much organic matter and, dark richness we're really providing in that soil type. So, Brian, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah. Again, soil type matters here. And so we've got listeners all over the place. And so this is going to be, you're going to have to figure this out a little bit locally. In terms of soil type, I've got a lot more clay than you all have. And so what I tend to do is look at the 4-inch, and I'm glad you mentioned the mesonet, Carl, because the guys at Davis, they've got those sensors in there. So that's typically my starting point. For those of you that don't know, the Davis Purdue farm would be on the eastern side of Indiana, probably about hour and a half, 2 hours from Indianapolis east, and just a little bit north of 70, maybe about 25, 30 miles north of 70, give or take. So that gives you some geography. So I do look at the 4-inch depth from Davis and those things. And again, one of the other things I carry with me is a real inexpensive analog soil thermometer. And I'll be out in the field. I actually like to look at temperatures midday is when I like to look at them. Basically, to your point, Crystal, I'm looking at it at the warmest part of the day. And then over time and experience, I kind of have figured out a little bit of the diurnal temperature cycle through the day based on my soil type. Now, for me, the other thing that you got to factor into is this moisture conversation, because remember, it takes a whole lot more thermal energy to warm up a soil that's at saturation or has a lot of water in it compared to one that's got a lot of pore space. That's why your guys' sands warm up way faster than what my clay soils do. But I'm going to start at the 4-inch depth. Then when I'm in the field, I'm looking at what the temperature is at that roughly 2-inch depth, knowing that if we're in the heat of the day, you've got what you're going to get at 2 inches. You're probably not going to get any more. On the other hand, if I'm out in the morning scouting a field and we're, look roughly at a similar temperature at 4 to 2, which is pretty uncommon, but it can happen. But I'm looking at soil or seed depth, where we're going to plant middle of the day. And if I agree with you guys, if I'm someplace, I'd really prefer to be a little north of 40, Carl, north of 50 in my geography than, coming up to 50 to get started. But if I'm at 51, 52 degrees and I know we're in a warming cycle where we're getting a lot of temperature, coming, as long as we've got soil moisture that's the right spot, go plant. But I got to be honest, I'm probably more stuck on making sure soil moisture is correct than I am temperature. It's on the list, but it's a long second to soil moisture for me.
I think it's like your 80-20 blend of talc graphite. It's 80% on the moisture side of the equation, 20% on the temperature. If it's fit and we're not obscenely early, like dropping the planter in on March 25th or something, like 4 acres I serve, then absolutely let it rip if we're within reason there. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. Moisture is everything in this conversation. And the thing you commented on about how those sands warm up more during the day, we also drop more during the evening, and that's the challenge, right? Is so how do we make sure we don't put that seed through too much stress? Those sands are going to fluctuate. They could be 20 degrees during the day to their overnight lows, but maybe carrying this conversation a little bit further. Why on earth do we care about that uniform emergence or the seed not sitting in the ground for 3-4 weeks? Well, thinking this through, it's if you do get more uniform emergence, that means as it relates to corn, you've got plants that are more likely to hit kind of that same pollination window. You're not going to be competing with each other at different growth stages as it relates to, acquisition of nutrients and sunlight and all that good stuff. But you're really looking at that warming trend, as we've talked a number of times about, because that means we're going to jump out of the ground as opposed to sit in the ground. And if we sit in the ground, all you're leaning on is the defenses of the seed treatment. You're not outgrowing any fungal pathogens. You're spending more time and energy trying to bust your way through maybe a less than ideal seed furrow, perhaps. And so this is where you see agronomists. They may give you a forecast per se of these are good conditions to get planted into, assuming your moisture's right, as opposed to these are less than ideal because we've got kind of cooler, more moderate temperatures that we're just not going to get out of the ground for another few weeks. So
Brian and Carl mentioned, just wanted to plug in here, some temperature data online. So for the Illinois folks listening, we have, if you look up It's called WARM. You can just search the word WARM, Illinois. And it's the Illinois State Water Survey, and they have a water and atmospheric resources monitoring program is what that is. So you can go through, there's different sites across the state, and you can find some data there. So just wanted to plug. You might have to create an account, but yeah, it's a good resource. I encourage, regardless of what location, I'm sure your land grant university in your state probably has some good resources to explore soil temperature and different information along those lines.
Carl, your comment about emergence, Pioneer, we've done several studies over the years. We've got a really nice chart that I show on a pretty regular basis to folks just to give some perspective on this delayed emergence, even from plant to plant, the impact, to give you some idea and understanding of how important it is to have a uniform seed bed, not only from a tillage practice standpoint, but in terms of this temperature and everything. If you were to plant your corn and you had roughly 85% of it come up what we'll call early emergence, and then you had 15%, so the rest of it that came up a week and a half later, just because of emergence, you're taking about 5 or 6% potential yield right off the table at the beginning. And then at the very extreme, if you had those early plants come up and then it was another delay to get up the rest of the field to 3 weeks, you're talking about almost 20% loss potentially just because of that. And so, certainly we know there's folks in the industry that talk about trying to get everything up in 24 hours or a little more. That may be really extreme. I understand what they're trying to do. I think you've got to be just a real nitpicker to get that done. And that's what those guys are advocating. And I completely agree. But I think in long-term scale, if you look at it, man, if you can get everything up in 3 or 4 days, you're going to be in good shape. But if that delay in getting the rest of that farm up is more than a week, you're going to have not only the pollination issues and everything you talked about, but there are some lasting impacts to yield that you just can never compensate for once you get that. So,
well, and a great opportunity to see it for real on your own farm, right? Let's say that you've got a stand and you see that it's erratic in its emergence. Go ahead and do the flag test, right? And get an idea and like you said, Brian, this is not an every 12-hour window that we're worried about. Maybe take it as here's the first 2 days of emergence and here's the next 2 days of emergence, because those are the windows we're talking about where if you were to husk back ears, you'd actually see those differences in ear size. So yeah, I think we're perfectly aligned that it's not the first 12 hours of emergence that we're worried about. It's more, how does it all come together in 12 days closer to.
We've got a really good research. I want to plug this in here because I think it fits with it. The guys last podcast talked a lot about singulation, and that's important, but I also want to put it into some perspective so folks understand. We've got some research that kind of shows the impact on yield of different planting effects. And so if you think about trying to achieve uniform emergence, if you just look at that in terms of what it impacts yield on, it's someplace between 5 and roughly 10% of your overall yield is predicated on getting good emergence. Planting in the right window, so calendar date, weather, all of those things, is someplace between 2 and 5%. Achieving the correct population, which we can get to here in a couple minutes, is about 2%, but achieving uniform plant spacing is 2% as well. We spend a ton of time working on singulation, and it's incredibly important. We know that, but just think about that 2% for getting the correct singulation. Getting uniform emergence could be as much as 10% of your yield. And so I would like to tell everybody, let's keep everything in perspective. That doesn't mean they're not important, but understand what's the most important out of some of those things that we think about as we get ready to go to the field.
I think that's a great call out. You think about singulation and how much time we spend kind of keeping an eye on the planter monitor and saying how is that, are we at 99% singulation, and you start to get, at what point do you get worried? But like you said, Brian, that 2% impact on yield. One thing I'd submit for consideration, yes, spacing, it's something that is in our control, so let's control it. But it's the skips that we care about. It is not the doubles. It is not where you've got, instead of a plant every 5 inches, you got one, 3 inches here, and then, 5 inches for your next spacing. It really comes down to, where are my gaps? Where are the skips? And that's the biggest thing, that if we can, I'd rather have a planter doubling up far more than it is actually skipping. That's
Yeah.
ultimately where we get penalized as it relates to singulation.
Well, and this all goes back to, I think, and this is maybe a little elementary, but I think it's worth stating, and Crystal kind of started us off here, is you've got to go and you've got to get behind the planter, and you have to dig. You have to find that seed. You have to measure depth. You have to look at those things. There are a group of folks that set the planter one time, the very first field, and then never adjust depth or never look at adjustments on that planter throughout the rest of their planting window, however long it is. And really, that needs to be a field by field check that you've got to do. When you get into the field, you get it opened up. And I don't even recommend doing this on the end rows. I would prefer to see you do it in the long rows. But get out, dig behind that planter, and make sure that everything is still set correctly. I've been in a lot of fields where, well, it planted fine the field before, it didn't. So
Brian, you mentioned the impact that being in that optimal window has. We talked about, okay, what should conditions look like to get started, and how that varies on your ground. But we've had in the last 5-10 years some exceptional conditions. I think about 2019 and the prevent plant year, 2020, depending on where you were in the countryside. But how has your thoughts on delayed corn planting changed into the last based on recent experience?
Yeah.
How has it evolved?
I can answer this a couple ways, Carl. I guess the first thing I will say is, and we had a colleague that said this on a regular occasion, if the plan is the plan going into spring, follow through with the plan the rest of the way. And so the reason I bring that up is because over the years, I've seen a lot of guys either give up on a crop because it was late planted or whatever, and then their neighbor who didn't was rewarded for continuing to manage through it. So with that said, quite honestly, I'm probably more optimistic, and this would go against some of the data that we see, but I'm more optimistic personally about continuing to plant corn for longer than we would traditionally think to, just because I have seen, at least in the short term here, like you say, maybe the last 6 or 8 years, I've seen even late planted corn do incredibly well. Now, is it as good as what the early planted corn was in an optimum window? No, it was not, but it was not bad corn either. And so my cutoff date for when to stop planting corn has continued to slide later and later into June, frankly, for me. Now, we've obviously got to make oftentimes some hybrid maturity adjustments for that. But beyond that, my own personal opinion is that I think these modern hybrids will handle later planting better than what we had even 10, 12, 15 years ago. So my date has slid back quite a bit. Some of that's predicated on conditions. But, if we're in a situation and a guy needs to plant corn, I don't have any problem planting corn in the first week of June anymore.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've had a number of operations that have had their best corn in the month of June, and that's not because what was planted in the month of May or the month of April that they were dogs. It was just, if you couldn't get in those years, June is just June corn's just fine. So in principle though, let's go ahead and figure this out as it relates to current prices and all that stuff. And so just tying this one out, roughly half a bushel per day is kind of what I've seen in the area that I serve. So if you think all the way across northern Illinois to Crystal, all the way across, northern Indiana to the eastern bounds by you, Brian, you're looking at about a half a bushel a day of loss as you kind of get out of that optimum window. And if you translate that to almost $5 corn prices, you're looking at roughly that $2 a day is kind of the acre loss potential there. So yeah, 475 corn, 4 4/10 of a bushel per loss a day is what we see in our local data, if you will. Knowing now that if you've got corn that can maybe tolerate delays a little bit better than what beans can, let's take the transition and conversation to soybeans, and how do we feel about soybeans in a delayed planting situation? How do y'all prioritize? If you got one planter, who's rolling first?
Go ahead, Crystal.
Okay, no, yeah, that's okay. That's funny. No, we can get like so passionate about talking about corn, and I'm sure we'll continue to be passionate about talking about soybeans. So, as we shift gear to soybeans, yes, corn, that firm date of we got to plant it in April or whatever, like really, especially as I look across my area, corn we can run through May 20th. I feel comfortable with still, and then you don't really see much of a loss. Soybeans is a different conversation though. Anytime that we can get it planted in April, in the first week to 10 days of May is really where I'd like to kind of keep us, or at least 5 days of May. That's really where I'd ideally plant all my soybean crop. Obviously, conditions matter. Don't really want it to be super cold soils and cloudy days and not much of GDU accumulation. That's not going to win for anybody really either. But as you think about in the past history that we've done, or some research that we've done, we've seen about a half a bushel per day loss on soybeans as you delay planting into May. So I'm talking, late May, we can really accumulate quite a bit of significant yield loss or less potential there. So not that you can't still have some good high yielding beans at the end of May. I think for your fertility needs, maybe increase a little bit more. But ideally, for figuring out which planter, I've kind of leaned more towards running soybeans first, and, corn, we've got a little bit more flexibility. And if we're in a season that we can't get everything planted by May 20th, then I think we're in a different type of season all around. So that's kind of my 2 cents. What do you think,
Brian, what gives with that? There was a point in time where we used to think that soybeans, you wanted the soil temp to be closer to 60 instead of 50 degrees. And here we are talking about, the advantage of planting beans first. And I fully agree and subscribe to what Crystal shared there. What is it different where you have more crusting challenges, or why is it that we see such an advantage to planting beans early and outside of what we used to hold as the conventional optimum soil temperature? What's that all about?
I think there's probably 3 things that I would put it on. One is modern soybean breeding. I think that's a big thing. And obviously we're going to be biased toward the folks that we work with that, we can talk about and even have on the podcast at some point who are our soybean breeders. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing are seed treatments, and these new modern seed treatments and some of the things that we're doing within the Pioneer seed treatment that are beyond kind of what the standard stuff has been with that. And then the third thing that a lot of people don't think about, Carl, but I really do believe that the game changer for soybeans, both in terms of yieldability, plantability, and then in terms of being able to get in early, are 15 and 20 inch row planters that are units that singulate, that have adjustment and everything. I think if we were still in the days of the old 750 John Deere drill, or the Crush Busters, or the Ties, or the Great Plains, all of those that folks were familiar with when we first started doing no-till soybeans, I don't think we would see the yields, and I still don't think we would be able to capitalize on early planting windows like we do now. And so in my mind, those are probably the 3 big things that have impacted our ability not only to get into the field and do a good job early, but also have shown us all of this data that we've been talking about for years about hitting this optimum window in April, like Crystal talked about, why we're seeing the yields we're seeing on soybeans. And frankly, in my part of the world, I sell 1.9s and I sell 3/8. and planted early, they all are great yielders. They really are. I've had some guys harvest, whole fields of 90 bushel, 1.9s and 2.0s before. I've got guys that have done the same thing with the late beans in my part of the world. And so from a genetic standpoint, there was always this thought that an early bean, because it was quote unquote bred up north and we just drug it this direction to use. That's not the case. The Windfall Research Station here in Indiana, they breed early beans there, and they're made for, call it central Indiana. I mean, it's broader than that, but I think that the modern breeding has made a huge difference too, and how we've structured our breeding program has helped us a bunch to be able to use all sorts of varieties in those early planting windows now.
I think you're right. The biggest management tactic that we have as it relates to soybeans, it's not fertility, it's not fungicide or insecticide. It is, when did you get those beans in the ground? That's the biggest lever we have to pull. And to your point, it's, ask which soybean is going to yield more planted early. We could have a debate about that and operational efficiency and all that stuff. But the answer is whichever one gets planted first is going to have the highest yield potential. And that comes back to the concept of the earlier we get those soybeans planted, the sooner they get into the reproductive stages based on heat unit accumulation. And, obviously there's going to be some seasonal triggers related to when those get engaged. But soybeans, if they are reaching the reproductive stages prior to the peak of the summer solstice, where we have peak sunlight availability, that's where you have all of the extra resources. You can continue to accumulate, more than enough photosynthate so that you have reduced bloom loss. This is why we actually see the big benefit related to soybeans that they're planted early. You're just hitting that reproductive stride when you have the most groceries coming to the family.
What about depth, Carl? We talked a ton. I mean, that does factor a little bit into this with soybeans as well. I mean, certainly planting early, but we talked about depth there. I mean, some of the same things that we talked about in corn apply, but there's that piece too. And I mentioned the planters. What's the optimum soybean planting depth in your guys' mind?
Go ahead, Crystal.
I was just going to make a joke. I was going to say, well, we just drop them on the ground and they yield 100 bushels. So,
right. No, you do. You live in Illinois. That's the way that will.
Illinois problems.
Just do that now.
Yeah.
No, Carl, you could take the serious answer. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I'm an inch and a half ish. There's room for negotiation there, Brian. Where I get nervous is where we get less than an inch. We get into dangerous territory. And my opening comments as it related to soil moisture, it probably is more related to the soybean side of the equation, and you just have more consistent soil moisture the deeper you go. Yes, we could too deeply plant soybeans, but we had cited Don Kyle before. If memory serves, I think they've done studies where they're planting beans as deep as the planter will go, digging it in 4 inches or so and still getting a satisfactory stand of beans. So again, erring on the side of too deep as opposed to too shallow. But Crystal, your sentiments on bean planting depth.
Yes. No, please don't drop them on the ground, obviously. But no, I would say echo Carl, at the very least, go at least an inch. And I've honestly had service calls where, in some clays, we accidentally dropped them at like 3 inches and they chugged along. I mean, we eventually, they came up. It took a lot longer than what we were comfortable with, but, not by no means am I recommending 3-inch planting depth, but from that moisture aspect, if we do find, inch and a quarter, inch and a half planting depth where we are hitting soil moisture line, you're going to see those beans come up pretty quick. So, that would be my echo.
I'm in the same boat with you guys. Inch and a half, inch and 3/4 is pretty good for me. We do on occasion get some crusting issues over here. And so we can plant them too deep, but you don't know that until you get a big pounding, 2-inch rain one afternoon and have those issues. I mean, I have been known to have to carry a Craftsman screwdriver to be able to dig soybeans up before, because you'll break a pocket knife or bend one of those digger tools. But that's a really good spot for my geography, that inch and a half, inch and 3/4.
Brian, you mentioned, guys moving to narrower row beans, 15s and 20s as opposed to 30s. One challenge that I've seen is in those crusting environments, if you're planted early, you're slower to come up. That's why we're protecting them with seed treatments. I guess chase that squirrel briefly. I see as much value on the insecticide component of the seed treatments planted early because you have that, you have a greater pest pressure preponderance there with those earlier planted beans. So just sharing why we see the value in insecticide, not fungicide only, but okay, that squirrel's been chased. Tell me, where do you feel you're getting too close to the sun, where you're dropping seeding rates too low in a 15-inch planter environment? Because that's something that I had enough service calls this last year where I can't treat a 15-inch row planter the same as the 30-inch row planter because
Sure.
you have fewer beans pushing up all at the same time. So what feels right if you know that you're going to be in a potential crusting situation?
Yeah. So the data that often gets quoted, and I believe, and you might check me on this, for years in the Purdue Pocket Guide, which I haven't had a new one in a long time, but for years they quoted, I believe it was Jim Berline out of Ohio State, and Dr. Berline had said that 80,000 beans would be, I'll have to double check the number for our listeners, but I think it was like 95% of optimum yield.
Sure.
So for a long time when we were doing replant, we would think, okay, if you've got 80,000 and they're evenly spaced, then you've got enough. Now, for my part of the world, evenly spaced was never an issue, so we always had to replant even if they were at 80,000. Yep. In terms of that, I chase that squirrel only to say that in terms of planning, right now, I've got guys who are doing variable rate technology that are experimenting with spots where they're going down as much as 100,000 planting.
Yeah.
In areas maybe that are really good, nice, black, low ground, maybe white mold pressure, those kind of things.
Sure.
In my mind, that's perhaps too close to the sun, to use your words. I really feel like when we're planting, the minimum that I'd like to see for most guys in my geography is probably no less than 115. The average planting population in 15s and 20s, and honestly, we don't make much of an adjustment between those in the field. We're probably right around 155. Now, for folks that are due variable rating, we are going, as I mentioned, some folks as low as 100,000. And then I do still have some guys that I think honestly are a little bit on the high side, that their highest rate will be 185 or 190. I like 155. I think that's a good compromise between getting enough beans out there and then potentially protecting yourself if we do get crusting and we have some issues. But to your point, putting beans in a row with a precision planter of some kind, that push that comes is unbelievable. Just the force of a growing soybean to be able to get up when they're in a row like that is fascinating. I'm sure someone's done the actual pressure testing to learn how hard they do push. I've not seen that data. It would be really interesting to see because road beans make a huge difference for us when it comes to those crusting conditions. There's just no doubt. I've seen it too many times.
One of my neighboring agronomists actually terms that push like the power of buddies, buddy beans popping up all together. We have a lot more, I feel like, across the state of Illinois or in general, more 30-inch rows. And so I think that is a benefit of that power of buddies in some of that environment. But I just wanted to call out, I think we saw a few service calls this last year with our earlier planted beans and pairing that with a lower population. Really, if we're pushing early on that time frame and it is a little bit cooler conditions that we're dropping these beans in, say you are, close to the sun and trying to run 115 or, something on the lower end, I think we need to increase that population a little bit more because we don't have that guarantee of how many of all of those 115,000 are actually going to come up. So to help, come up, and heck, it helps with some of the crusting concerns and different things too, because those beans are probably going to sit below ground a little bit longer.
So we had some challenging service calls here this last year that we ended up a little bit lower than what we would have ideally liked to see on that. So just want to call that out.
Crystal, I want to make a comment about the lower populations too. I think this is something to think about. So the three of us have been in wheat scouting mode here recently just because of the time of the year. And when we're out scouting wheat fields this time of year, we're not paying attention to what the population was that was planted back in the fall. We're actually out and we're counting tillers, and we're trying to figure out how many heads per square foot we're going to get. One thing that I want to remind everybody of is remember how your soybean plant works. And so just because you planted 115 and then you only end up, maybe in your situation you talked about, Crystal, maybe you only end up with 100. If those are evenly spaced, there is something to be said for the amount of additional nodes that you will have on those thinner spaced plants. And remember that your nodes means blooms and means potential pods. And so there is some thought, at least in my mind, that at some point down the road, as we understand more about bean physiology and we understand more about population, that maybe there's a thought transition that goes on as we get into later development stages where we start to think about beans in terms of number of nodes per plant per square foot. So that we can, that's how these plants are compensating for those thinner populations anyway. And so I don't want anybody to think that we're saying, well, if you plant 115 and you've only got 100, you got to do it over again. I don't think that's the case at all, because soybeans have an amazing ability to compensate for themselves. But I think what we're driving at is give the things the best chance you get or you've got first out of the boat. Let's not shave any corners. Let's not rely on that necessarily. Let's hope we get 115 of our 115 up or close to it, within percentages. But I do think there's something to be said for this idea that thinner planted soybeans, more nodes per plant, more per acre could mean as good, or even in some cases, depending on disease pressure and other things, might actually end up out yielding something that's seeded at 185.
Right. Right. No, this is a great conversation. I'm aligned with Crystal that the earlier in your window you are, the higher your seeding rate should be, because you're guarding against the, more challenging conditions those beans are being put through. If you're in a reduced tillage situation, you're planting beans early and we're on the margins of it being fit, but you got a lot of acres to crawl across. You don't want to treat your corn that poorly. These are justifications to increase that seeding rate. Now, we're not saying drastically, by 50,000 or anything like that. And, if I do the back of the envelope math, if you're buying $75-ish treated beans, and you're increasing the seeding rate by 10,000, that's pretty cheap insurance. That's $5 an acre to ensure that you don't have to come back and replant those puppies. Because the challenge is, Brian, we started this conversation with, if we're in 15s, you got to have enough to get up and out of the ground to start, because you don't have the power of buddies as much as you have in the 30s. And so if we find out we do need to replant, overseed those beans, you're probably not going to be figuring that out until these beans have a few leaves to them, right? You're going to be past the cotyledon stage, past the unifoliate stage. Maybe you catch them by the second trifoliate. By the time you have the first true leaves out, all of a sudden the bean is already sensing the amount of light and competition and resources that it's coming up against. In that situation, we just might be adding beans for the sake of weed suppression, not yield contribution. And so that's why it's so critical to get it right the first time. That I think of bean seeding rates as, it's a valley. You start on the high side of the hill, you come down in the middle of your optimum planting window, your normal, call it early mid-May window, maybe you start to drop it a little bit. But then when you come back up, to your point, Brian, on nodes per acre, once you start running out of season, you're going to have to artificially increase that nodes per acre by putting more plants out there late, last week of May, early weeks of June. But those reproductive branches that we could get out of a thin stand of beans, it's true, there's something there. It's just, you got to make sure you get them out early enough, to be able to capture that, because if you got to come back and thicken it up, it's weed suppression. It's not yield contribution oftentimes by the time we actually make a replant decision. In the spirit of wrapping things up, I think that Crystal, you did a great job talking about how about a half a bushel per loss per day on soybeans. If you're looking at $10, $11 beans, that's a $5, a day type of loss on an acre basis. That's twice what it is on corn. So again, just, the math backs up the agronomy here when it comes to, if you got one planter to run, it's going to be the bean planter on the early side of things. So nothing that you haven't heard before, but just, good reinforcement with local experience and local math. So with that, Brian, Crystal, anything that we missed as it relates to the agronomics of planting on corn and soybeans for 2026?
Not necessarily the agronomics, but I would point everybody to pioneer.com. If you have questions about populations, there are some really great resources on populations, very specifically on the corn side. You can go there. If you click under agronomy and then click on tools, the plantability stuff for corn is right there that you can go on to. You can put your corn price in terms of what you paid per bag, or maybe it's 1,000 seeds, and your commodity price, and it will show you the economic population for your individual hybrids. Now, some of maybe the very newest ones are not there, but that's a great resource for folks who are maybe curious about what makes sense for them. Certainly double check those numbers that you see with your rep, because there are some local adjustments that need to be made. But I certainly like to point people there. We didn't really talk a lot about populations specifically on corn today, but I would point people to pioneer.com for that tool, Carl.
Mm-hmm. In addition to that, we have, like Brian said, local recommendations. So be sure to just cross-reference those with your local Pioneer rep. But on top of that, there's local or regional planting guides that have tons of resources, whether it be about planting depth, whether it be about early planting, all the different, or seed orientation even, tons of really great resources. So please take a moment before we take the planter out there, a good rainy day activity as you wait for soils to warm up.
One last thing, Ryan, you'd mentioned the populations that we have available on pioneer.com. Same thing, if you just put in your search engine of choice, Pioneer Plantability will also give you the actual planter recommendations based on your meter for your individual seed batch that's optimized, as we have a whole lab that's dedicated to that space to make sure you're getting the most out of your Pioneer dollar spent. So lots of good conversation today as it relates to planting. I'm grateful that we're talking about it now. Hopefully here in a month's time, we've got a good jump on things, and it'll be a lot of fun this spring. So those of you that listen to the conclusion of this episode, we thank you for going on this journey with us. Brian, is there any last sentiments to leave the folks with before we wrap up?
Not at all. I think we've covered everything, or at least the important stuff today for sure.
Okay, very good. Crystal, same feelings at this point?
Sentiment. Absolutely.
Okay, good deal. Well, awesome. Thank you again for listening to another edition of the, let's see, we are the, what's the name of our new enterprise now? The Outstanding in Your Field. Yes, now can be searched on your favorite podcast platform of choice. Thanks for the assist there, Brian. But with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's episode. So thanks for listening. We'll see you down the road.
This has been another episode of Outstanding in Your Field. Like and follow our podcast wherever you are listening. We've got a new episode at least once a month. You can also find us on YouTube by following Pioneer Seeds. You can find me on Instagram at B_K_Schrader.
I'm Crystal Williams. You can contact me at crystal.williams@pioneer.com.
And I'm Carl Joern. You can follow along with me at Joern on X, or on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. That's CJOERN.
That concludes this Pioneer Agronomy video podcast. Visit our page on pioneer.com and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for more agronomy insights.